Hi, everybody.
Welcome to this space. We're very excited to be, reflecting on this project and talking to you about this collaboration that made it into an amazing show
Yeah.
that we have up at Heaven Gallery in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
I know that people are all over different places in the world, different time zones, so we really appreciate you being here.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. It's great to be able to have you here, and like these kinds of like possibilities of how we can meet together and connect in this way is sort of very much aligned with the concepts of the show too. Is just sort of what's possible. How can we sort of create these conversations and connections that span more space and time and sort of create closeness. So great.
Yeah, so I guess we like the project had changes and different um, different ways of actually working, like as a viewer and as a participant. And also, of course, like time this year has been so crazy. So the project changed a lot. Uh, but it allowed for lots of like flexibility and reflection and what could be possible. So at some point, like at the beginning, we were thinking of how we could see like a reflection of each other's work and like thinking of your own process in relationship to other people's processes and how like these overlapping experiences can become something different. And and then of course throughout this collaboration we encounter a lot of these moments. I think it emphasized much more the fact that we were really only being together through either a screen or just wanting to be seen in a community like, in a different way, because we were so isolated at some point, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I think both of us, what was sort of, I think Karen and I have both talked about the fact that we, through this process, have probably talked to each other more than anyone else in our network of people besides our family, and sort of that coming to this project with our each individual sort of ideas about how this was going to look and how it was going to work, and then creating together this sort of almost like third presence, this third space where sort of our two individual identities formed this third thing. And we're sort of hoping that like that became it did become sort of like the place where the fermentation happened, and like the place where like the incubation happened for these ideas. And we feel really lucky in a funny way that like we had the time to just keep thinking about the show and sort of be able to expand our ideas with the delays from COVID and things. So we sort of really came up with something that sort of remarked on all of that, or tried to remark on all of that.
Yeah, I guess we can start with
sure,
the
yes, we
slideshow,
should get
and then
started.
we can go through some images and keep talking.
Yeah.
One of the things that a collaboration allows is to get to know each other in a different way. And as you said, like this third space requires a lot of trust, because then there's like this vulnerability where you are there not really knowing how this is going to work, but and a lot of faith in both of us, because we just, instead of like retrieving and trying to make this simpler and just inviting a couple of artists to participate, we were like, no, we definitely need more people here, and we need more community, and we need to like reach out to others and even manifest the work in different instances. So this is one of the pieces that I chose to work within it. And one thing that we discussed like is the personal mechanics of how each of individual artists works. And especially during the pandemic, like for me, I was just looking at the objects that I've been moving with over and over from place to place, and the history and the content and all of the emotional relationship that one projects into these objects. And from that, then I created like different pieces that I've been working on with puzzles and sculptures and the relationship between an object, the painting as an object, going outside of the wall and installing these as a different a different thing to look at and a different relationship to have with these objects. And so I do have a system of working, and I was thinking of lots of my personal history and my family history. And then in a larger group exhibition, then it activates other parts of it too, because it relates to other people's work, and the process of other works in the show bring out other details of these pieces. So that's so unexpected.
Yeah. And I think both of us our way of working in our own artwork definitely had like really dramatically informed the way that we put the show together, because there is that kind of quality of arrangement and context in both of our work, and that kind of malleability and flexibility in terms of like, this might be how it's installed here, but it could be installed dramatically different with, and the appearance of it would look different based on its context. And that might seem obvious, but it certainly was a huge influence, had a huge influence on how we put the show together. So these kinds of like using a personal narrative and collecting different shapes and different ideas and objects from our personal history, that's definitely involved in our work, and it sort of collapses on a surface or in a single arrangement that feels like it's very particular to the context and the moment that we're in now. So, but as we were working, we made our selections last, I think, in terms of what we were going to put in after we had met with all the artists and decided what we were sort of going to pull from everybody. And then we started to see these formal connections then. So, you know, like the different shapes, the negative spaces in these handle shapes are repeated. These blues are repeated, and we'll see that in different install shots. You can see, depending on how your screen looks right now with where your image is, there's a bright blue sort of bookending this room. These curving spaces, these curving shapes, these greens and blues and like kind of orangey browns, just sort of these threads of colors and other formal connections just were going through the work on top of the connections that were happening beyond just the visual, right? The connections that were happening with the gesture, with how it was put together, the materials, and we sort of continued to like that idea of just sort of the malleability and sort of each piece and each artist sort of like almost rising to meet the other work and create connections in the space together. Should we talk about the print component?
Yeah, so as part, like we invited at the beginning 8 artists to participate in this show with physical work to put in the gallery. And at some point in the pandemic, we didn't know if the gallery was going to be open. So we were like thinking of, oh, let's think about the project in a virtual show. How would you put together a virtual show? Mm-hmm. So then we were thinking of like, okay, so maybe if it's virtual, instead of just having these 8 artists, we can extend the invitation to like a +1 idea. Like, let's invite other artists. And it doesn't have to be a local artist. Now you can have anyone, you know, you can have anyone, anywhere. Mm-hmm. To be, and that was an opportunity instead of a limitation. So we extended an invitation, and then when we actually had like the end result of like, yes, the gallery will be open, we decided to then really materialize these artworks in an edition of digital prints. So these are, of course, like the artists who have physical work have a print that it's for, like, it's related to the piece that it's there, but it's manifesting itself in a print. And then they invited another artist outside of this group to collaborate in another print to put together with theirs.
And just thinking about sort of
I'm sorry, I have a question. So these two pieces of Monica and Dan's, is this a collaboration? I am now seeing, are these prints, did these two artists collaborate together on these pieces? Because they do.
These are pieces that I think a lot of, and we'll see different relationships with this part of the project with different pairs. I think in this case, this is a detail of Monica's piece that's in the show, in conversation with a piece that already existed from Dan. And in terms of the collaboration, we can actually ask Monica what that conversation was like, how that back, and that's something that we're hoping to hear more of in this talk as well, is just sort of the exchanges that these different pairs were having. So
cool.
This is our first print. So just again, I'll turn it over to Monica, but thinking about these different ways that where we were visiting shows, right? Like everything was online, a digital experience. So really this playfulness of taking something physical, making it digital, but then giving the opportunity to see it sort of physically hung in the gallery, and then be able to sort of put it in a price range that made it more possible for people to actually be able to take it home and just import the work into their own home and their own collection in a different way that I feel like we were all sort of getting really thirsty for with these digital experiences. So it's informed by both of those ways of viewing artwork and going through those different processes. So Monica and Dan are both Chicago artists, but Monica, do you want to say anything about?
Sure. I mean, I would have to say that I wouldn't call it a collaboration. I would say more of an invitation that I extended to Dan, because I felt his work really worked with my work very well. I mean, he does a lot of print work, very strong graphic, and I sent him my image and let him curate his work with mine. So that's how we handled it. It was pretty simple.
Yeah. And I think we'll hear lots of different ways that conversation happened between the pairs. So yeah, and that's how we originally thought of it too, sort of like an invitation, like what connections do you see? Who do you want to sort of pull into this project with you? And
collaboration, I didn't mean like in the same piece, both artists working together, but like the pieces were hanged in pairs with each artist who has physical work there and the artists that they invited together in a conversation with each other. Like going back to this first idea of how like you see reflected, your work reflected in other people's work. So that was part of it as well.
Yeah. And we played around a lot with these prints. Luckily, we worked with a really good guy, Matt Harleton, who set up a fine art print shop in the pandemic to sort of pivot to that. So he was brand new, and he was really very generous with us in terms of this process. We just kept on getting larger and larger and rethinking the margins and all this, but we really wanted the work that was seen only via print to really have the same kind of presence in the space and not be seen as like this support piece, but really as like a major part of the whole conversation. And so we connected that in visually and through sort of the formal threads as much as we did with the physical installation. Yeah, go ahead. I had a hard time with that. Also, I tried to, sorry for the switch around. I kept on accidentally clicking on this. I was trying to read the chat. So if you have something in the chats, I can't see it. So just feel free to say
feel
something.
free to jump into the conversation.
Yeah.
Verbally. We'll love to hear your voices and your experiences.
So this is Monica's work too, with Tracy Taylor's behind, Tracy Marie Taylor.
So you like here, it's very clear, like from the print, you can see the relationship with Monica's sculptural work. And then behind there's a sculptural piece that it's also flat. So it's like the flat getting more 3D-dimensional, and the 3D-dimensional getting more flat into like a sculpture on the wall, and then something that you usually might see like in 2-dimensional language, like a line, an outline, and like the edges of the page and the margins. Shapes like that are treated in a 3-dimensional way.
Yeah, and that kind of like stacking that's happening in both of these works, like Monica's stacking these individual volumes, and then Tracy's behind is a sort of a sculptural interpretation of sound waves that are also stacked on top of each other. So these kinds of ways of sort of putting the work together in the space is apparent here. Let's see, I think we have the other one of Monica's work, but this was really exciting to work with, because all of the work, once it was together in the space, we were seeing sort of the same sort of metaphor happening of just like the sort of the joining together, sometimes literally, sometimes more metaphorically, sort of putting materials together or different parts of history together, and sort of actually like joining the fibers, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Monica, do you want to share a little bit more about your process and your work?
Oh, God.
I know.
You don't have to.
Sure, of course. I think I'm basically trained as a painter, but I think as you can experience with these two pieces, I'm spending more time bouncing back between the 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional. And I think what you guys just said is interesting, because I do try to pull off that flat abstract sense, that flatness, and try to create volume with it. And it's been challenging and interesting because I never studied sculpture before. And I have to say I'm having so much fun making these works, because I really went into it not knowing how to do anything and figuring out how to build things. I sort of treat myself as like some sort of engineer that really, I'm engineering pieces together that I don't ever know how it's going to work out. So when I go back to doing the wall pieces, they sort of have a sense of sculpturalness to it that I try to bring to the flatness of it again. So I think my work is really, as you can see in the piece that is on the table that we were asked to bring, it's about cutting. I cut and cut and cut and recut and reassemble and sew. I use my hand, I use a sewing machine. I grab scraps from here and there. I have so much fabric at home, and I just keep going until it creates something that really starts having some kind of impact on me. I don't know if that explains my process, but it's sort of a messy one.
Yeah. And I think that again, sort of like we sort of wanted to pivot to you early on, because this kind of like layering up and stacking up and joining together and cutting and recutting and rejoining and revisiting and re-examining is, again, something that we encountered throughout the whole process and deeply informed our own way of putting it all together.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how other artists work, but I'm probably not that far from how people work.
Right.
Yeah.
The sense of the level of messiness is probably different for everyone.
So here's an installation shot of that, so you can get an idea of what the scale is too. Oh, and then next to that, then we have Laura Street's print and my print. So this is another pair. So again, really sort of using the prints as another avenue to sort of create formal connection, as if, you know, as if the work is physically in the space, and play around with that. So here we have Laura Street, and if she's here still, you can talk a little bit about, maybe we can talk about our conversations, but first you can maybe share about your process of working.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think I unmuted. Okay. So I really liked the way that Monica explained her process, because I work similarly, but also quite opposite. So I am also putting things together, but I am doing it with a master plan. So I of course play with it a little bit, but there's a master plan behind it. So everything has been completely planned out to make an entire picture. And this is just one piece of, so for this work, it's going to be 160 of these all put together. And this is just one little detail of the final piece. And I have it all in my head. So I do also have piles and piles of cloth behind me, but it's already planned out what color it's going to be and what shapes are going to be in there. And then I'm victim to whatever the sewing machine can actually do, and finagling everything the way cloth can move really changes what it really looks like, which is kind of a fun process.
And the resulting image is going to be somewhat representational, right? Like when you have all these assembled as this sort of grid, the resulting image, right, is a implosion scene of a casino in Las Vegas, right?
Right. Yeah. So it's kind of like the opposite. So of course, yeah, the building is something that is very quickly taken away, and I am very slowly putting it back together with cloth.
Yeah. And it changes. Like it's not a perfect representational gridded drawing because of the way that the fabric moves. And I think through our conversation, too, it was really interesting to find those kinds of connections of growing up in Las Vegas.
Yeah.
This project also gave us an opportunity to sort of like this big part of connection, like what can we do, how to reach further actually than from this place of isolation, like how far could we go, right? Like, so Laura and I grew up together and probably haven't seen or talked to each other since we were 12 or 13, and found each other. And I saw this work and I said, we need to partner with this. Yeah, I'm putting this show together. We need to work together. And you're in Berlin.
Yeah,
so
right.
We're going far in terms of the timeline and geographically. But what was exciting is this, the kind of like growing up in the desert in this really old environment, and how much like the changing landscape of the downtown Las Vegas has informed our work. So that kind of dramatic shifts in time. So anyway, I don't want to get too caught up, but thank you, Laura.
What is, Emily, your print that's so beautiful? Can you talk a little bit about?
Sure. This work is actually in the show.
Yeah.
In another slide, so I could wait.
I mean, you can talk a little bit about your process, or we can wait and see, whatever you prefer.
Sure. Yeah. This is an old drawing, like very old drawing that was started and then pulled back out of the portfolio, and then rearranged. I rearranged these objects on top as unfixed collage elements. A rock that my son found, a rolled up ball of paper that's stuffed into a new pair of shoes, some fringe that had been cut from jeans. So like this kind of, again, kind of collapsing of time in terms of an old drawing that is sort of reactivated in a different time.
Yeah, it's beautiful because it looks like it's like almost like a photo collage. Like you have a print, possibly the rock, and then you photographed it, or
Yes, yeah. So it's all arranged on top, and
yeah.
I photographed it. And then later in the slideshow, you'll see how it was installed differently in the exhibition.
Oh,
With the objects arranged on top.
So one other element that I think we should mention is that one another like prevalent idea of the show and the way it's installed is to revisit like that way of revisiting how you look at things. So some details are printed and some pieces are there physically. Some works are rearranged in a different way, but it's kind of like the same work in a different instance. The scale of things might change when you have the print and the actual work. So when you go through the rooms, there's 2 rooms in the gallery, and when you go through the rooms, you see things that have a way of repetition throughout the show, and you can go back and forth between how you see these different instances of the work. And it's just so nice to have that like revisiting of your childhood together and trying to see yourself, like both of you again, and recognizing that you're both different people, but you came from like the same place. So this is, part of it too.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of like memory recall too, you can go ahead, is something that we wanted to play with in the 2 rooms. Oh, here it is. So I arranged it here. I've attached a magnet to the back of the rock and used it as a way to sort of hold the paper up onto the paper and let it fall down. I think, again, playing the same with Monica is really playing around with that sort of straddling of the 2D and the 3D worlds. Like, is this a sculpture? Is it a drawing? Is it a collage? How can I sort of occupy all 3 conversations at the same time, and have that sort of spirit of rearrangeability, even though, you know, it's a set composition, but have that energy of something that's still temporary and malleable and could respond to different contexts and different changing circumstances. But that idea of sort of memory and recall and time and all of that is something that we want to, just sort of like the dream visitor would go to one room and see a connection and then go back to the other room and think, well, wait a minute, what are these 2? And we wanted to sort of put the prints of the person in a different context or in a different room altogether, so that people were really challenged to see the connections even subconsciously as they went back and forth from each room. So there is, again, the title of the show ended up being perfect in that way too. That's sort of like bouncing back and forth from the 2 rooms and these multiple conversations that are happening. This is Tracy Marie Taylor. Again, the floor sculpture piece of the visualization. She does a lot of data visualization with the sound waves in these 2 cases of her son crying in the monitor, in the baby monitor, and recording those sound waves and then translating it via CNC router to a CDC on the brain, to the physical object. And this is an instance where,
like this is her print on the left side. So she also plays a lot with the negative and the positive, white and black absolutes, and then she invited Sarah. I mean, these 2 were like the white sculpture on the floor and these prints were installed in the same room, so you could actually see the connection there, but it's not that obvious anymore because one, it's a print and it all flattens out
and it's a total reversal, right? Like the sculpture that's on the floor is white, and then she took the image, and this is the case where the relationship might be a little bit more collaborative in this instance, where Tracy's decisions were directly informed by the formal presentation of Sarah's work. So I think Sarah's here. If you wanted to say a few words, we'd love.
I'm here.
Hi.
Hi. Sure, I can talk a little bit about our communications. Thank you also for putting this together.
Mhm.
So Tracy and I have never met, and I live in Richmond, Virginia. So it was so great to have this way to, we didn't collaborate, but we did have a lot of discussion about what would formally go together.
Mhm.
So we have such overlapping sensibilities and subject matter. It really is fascinating. And I always love when I find those artists where you kind of get each other. And our paths have crossed from afar briefly, but we've never actually gotten to know each other. And I've never had more of a reason to reach out other than those overlapping sensibilities. So this was really great. Now that we've done something a little more closely together, I hope it leads to something else in the future. We both do data visualization. Mine's a little bit more poetic than hers. And we both make work about caring for our children. And so with those two things in mind, we kind of had a conversation about what might very specifically pair together. So I had this new series. This is a detail image of one of 74 tiles in the overall piece. And when she described what she was thinking of for hers, and I was familiar with these sound visualizations, I described this new piece to her, which the full piece is on display right now in Washington, D.C. at Culture House. But what I did is I swept my home every day of the stay-at-home order in my town in Richmond. So that was 74 days where we had a state's mandated stay-at-home order. So I swept my home and gathered the trash, the sweepings for each day. And then last summer, after the fact, I took each day's basically baggie of trash and printed them as photograms. So this represents one day of the trash that we brought into our home that day. So we were discussing the fact that these formally go together, they're monochrome. They kind of have this macrocosm simultaneously going on in both. And we love the fact that she's taking audio recording, she's taking sound, and I'm taking this kind of ephemera of the dust and the trash. And we're recording and making kind of a record of things that would otherwise be lost to time. And we're putting that in this fixed square and putting them next to each other. And you'll see that in some of these, in the overall piece, you do see these indications that there is a child living in my home just by the trash that's produced. So that was what our conversation revolved around, is what, with these big similarities that we have in our practice, what can we zoom in on and isolate as these tiles of the two squares to put next to each other to really home in on those similarities. So that was what our
are they both photograms, or just the one that I'm seeing is on the right is a photogram?
The one on the right is the photogram, well, reproduction of the photogram that I created. And then Tracy, I'm not sure, our coordinators might be able to give us a little more detail of the exact process of turning that sculpture into the reproduction. But I believe they photographed one of the sculptures you see in the space, and she manipulated it a little bit. Maybe someone else can speak about that more.
So she took a detail image of her white sculpture that's on the floor there, and just did a positive negative reversal and made all the black white and made all the white black, and sort of just to again strengthen that connection between what the two artists are the conversation, sort of strengthen it formally, which responds it in every other way.
And also because, these prints are made to be pieces independently of the original. It's not only documentation of the work, it's becoming something different. So then the artist took different paths in responding to this, to this idea of the print.
Yeah.
Can we move on?
Yes.
To the next one? So.
Yeah, the same conversation in Tracy's work. We're happy to discover that the conversation that was happening turning the black and white actually responded to a painting that we actually had already selected from Tracy to go back into the work. So these kinds of like happy coincidences just kept happening throughout this very stream of consciousness curation of the show. This kind of idea of time and, like you said, the ephemera and the fleeting nature of raising children and sharing space and caring for, also connects us to Angela Lopez's work. We have a very small sculpture. Maybe we have a install shot later on, but it's a very small sculpture here. And she also is working on this work in progress dollhouse where she's creating these miniatures in the dollhouse. Again, this sort of like very temporary arrangement of this work in progress. I don't think Angela is here. But Deirdre is.
Yeah. And then like, well, she works with this idea of, I mean, the dollhouse, it belongs to her family, like not only her generation, but like the generation before. So she's like continuing with this legacy that it's like an unfinished process that will probably last forever. She has a child as well now, and she's thinking of working and then giving it, like passing these to him in a creative way, and like playing together and thinking about the space and time. And then Deirdre, she's also working. I mean, she's here, so she can. But she also works with the things that they were consuming at home. So just going back to what Sarah was talking about makes a lot of sense too. Do you want to join us to talk a little bit about your process? It'll be great.
Sure. Yeah. So Angela approached me with the invitation, and I just, I love this conversation. I just love the whole, since the beginning, the playful sense of curation, and the way that the elements were kind of arranged. And that was very similar to the conversation Angela and I had. She knew that I sort of was a person that worked architecturally within the home. This is a print of a detail of a much larger screen. It's 8 foot by 4 foot. It's actually part of our house behind me here. And it's a separating wall between elements of our Chicago apartment. So when Angela, suggested the pairing of the prints, we were amazed by all the bounces back, like the fingers, when we saw both prints together, seemed to be like the positive version of those voids in my piece. Like we were really interested in the play and scale. And so the screen originally was made by collecting all the discarded snack boxes that my son, who's 8, consumes mostly. He's kind of like a trash food aficionado, and mac and cheeses and whole wheat pasta with the windows. And I've been collecting these for a couple of years. And then when the pandemic hit last year, all 3 of us, my husband was working from home, he's an architect, and my son was doing school from home. And we found that we needed more separation between the spaces in our home, so that this accumulation then became like a dividing screen. And so Angela's pared down scale of the dollhouse just seemed conceptually really suitable. So we had a really fun time.
That's amazing. I love it. It's amazing. The collection of the box, of the packaging and the use of it. That's fantastic. It's so cool.
Thanks. Yeah. And, there was a lot in the dollhouse about the void. And I don't know about you guys, but I felt like I was in the dollhouse all year, just like an extreme example of being, sort of trapped in your home for an extended period of time. So, yeah, it was a great conversation. And I've been teaching a collage class, and we covered exquisite corpse, and the whole thing reminds me of like a dimensional exquisite corpse in a certain sense, and it's been such a pleasure to be part of the conversation. Yeah,
Yeah.
Emily and Karen, you did such a beautiful job, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. I also love the time, the element of like time, like here Angela has this like family heirloom that's being restored and it's gonna survive. And then you have the collection of cardboard that's being painted that likely won't, right? Like it's not an archival material, but then it's being printed on an archival paper with archival inks that are meant to last several centuries, right? Like, so it's just this real back and forth there too. So thank you.
It's funny, I also had the opposite experience that Monica had, because primarily I'm a sculptor and installation artist. So having a piece that's just flat is so interesting too, as an element within the overall, curatorial composition. So that feels really unusual and interesting to me.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. That's great. That kind of, oh, and here's that kind of speaks to the playful curation of the show too. This was an accident, right?
It was an accident, and we, of course, when we saw it, we kept it, and we kept like fighting for it to show up in any different lighting that the gallery might have.
Yeah.
And we just did not install, we just use that part of the wall for the shadow of the house.
Yeah, it was where we put it just to get it up off the floor and get it safe, and the shadow appeared and it became, yeah, I think much to the dismay of Francine and Alma, we stayed late to just keep adjusting the lighting so we wouldn't lose it. So here's another work from Angela too. A stitched hand, which kind of is a good segue to, we use the sort of the visual segue of the hand from Angela's piece of definitely the body as a tracker of time to Curtis's work here. So this was also interesting, just as the most time, like the most intense in terms of its installation. Just it was very precise, like which was unlike the other things that we had in the show where we could be really like keep arranging and rearranging. We installed Curtis's first because it was so precise in terms of how it had to be installed. There was no like taking it off the wall and moving it after the fact.
Yeah, and we like this idea of like using our hand. Also, this piece came packed in the smallest container, so it felt like it was like going to take over a whole wall, but it came like in this very small package. So again, talking about what like you see flat and two-dimensional and going into three-dimensional, and the movement activates the piece and how you like walk through and how you see things. And then it goes also deep into how he, as a photographer, is using photographic material and how the like photojournalism is manipulated, but it's actually really being manipulated with his hands. So it again kind of like goes back into how we interact with this amount of information that we're consuming and in a very different way.
Yeah, and that revisiting a narrative, complicating it, a changing context and a changing environment adds to its complicatedness and what our position is in relationship to it. So your body actually, I don't know if the next slide, the next few slides might show it, but as you walk around, then the information is completely lost on the other side. So if you're standing on the other side of this image, it looks like white vertical blinds.
And you see the tape.
Yeah, and you see the tape and how it's put together. And then as you walk around, it starts to reveal itself, but it never becomes perfectly clear because it's never flat and completely joined. And so even the viewer's relationship with it in person is very complicated, and it's
also installed in a wall that on the other room, right back to back, here you can see his pair of prints. So he used that same piece, but in a completely different instance. It's like layered into like something flat that you cannot interact with anymore like that. It's so different. And then the play of the hands and the personal and the public sphere are very different, but both hands are the same man's hands. One is like with his son, because the collaboration between these artists, they're married to each other, so they decided to do this together. And it creates this sort of intimacy between, like, with the body, that it's very, very interesting to me. Like it creates a dialogue between them.
Yeah, and like Nikki Haley is using an image of a boy who has been a victim of warfare and is presenting this image to the UN, and the whole thing, it adds another layer of complicatedness in terms of what our position is with this information, with these images that are being used in journalism with our own personal narratives. So I love this pair of images.
Yeah, this is so beautiful. These two are it's amazing. And knowing now that they're a couple, and it's beautiful.
Yeah. Oh, so you can see a little bit. Here's Karen's pieces on the left here with Curtis's hung. You get to see a little bit of how the paper is bowing.
Yeah, and also like here, I'm trained as a painter, as Monica, but then I also, since the pandemic, I started working three-dimensionally. I'm making these sculptures out of whatever I had at home, using my hands in a very different way. So going from Curtis's hand and to this sculpture makes me like it was like a formal transition. But the way I manipulated the material was also very experimental and just trying to use my hands in a different way and trying to hold on into like a form that it's decaying, probably is not gonna last forever. And juxtaposing that with a painting, it creates a relationship, like a shadow relationship that portrays a more lively character, like thinking about a mirror, like, or an object that it's been there forever, that you don't really acknowledge, but it's been there. I encounter a lot of these objects through the background of my screen when I was in a Zoom call or something, where I was like, what is that? That looks weird. And then I looked and I was like, what? I haven't seen this in years and it's been there forever.
Yeah.
So I kind of like reclaimed the space that these objects had to appear again in a different context, and they had to be more of like like a main character instead of just a background.
Yeah, I was going to try to join on my phone so I could see the chat. I see someone has typed something, but I can't open it when I'm presenting. Maybe does someone have a question? Put something in the chat.
Jared
Okay.
just says very, very much enjoy this sculptural piece with the painting.
Okay.
Great,
Yeah. And that.
Yeah, and the print. This is the pair of prints that I work with, and the painting is there too in a different way. It's projected into another painting, so it's pointing out to a different space. And then I reached out to my friend Omar Barquet, who is in Mexico City. I grew up in Mexico City, and we both went to school there together. And formally, the works, like the shapes, the main shapes of the shape of the painting and this black shape on his print, are like mimicking each other, kind of like the silhouette part, but his is made out of text and different ways. But he took that work and put it outside on the street. So it has like a frame that does not belong to the piece that he made, but then it becomes something different when it's registered like that. And then on my side, I projected these. So we kind of like juxtaposed a lot of information. And I like that he's kind of like bringing out history of like this figure, like this pre-Hispanic figure, that it's kind of looked at in a fragmented way, and you cannot see it completely. And same, the painting, you cannot see it completely, but it's pointing out to a different context.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah. And it talks about the like that the way that the screen is like something that we also wanted to refer to in these prints is the way that the screen flattens everything. Like you can have multiple windows open on your screen at any given time, and it brings two things that don't belong anywhere near each other onto the same surface at the same time. And that is happening in our own narrative and timeline and personal histories and global histories. And like, it's all just sort of like a metaphor that's there.
yeah, we're just assimilating that way of perceiving information and visual language.
Mhm. There's an install shot. We'll talk about the objects at the end. I think did I see Jack sign on? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hi.
Hi, Jack.
Hey, how's it going?
Great. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, I'm driving to Maine right now.
Excellent.
Oh man. Yeah, thank you guys so much for putting this together and for, engineering such a creative curatorial project during a terrible time.
Thank you so much for joining us in the show and here. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I really just appreciate Will asking me. Will's been such a source of support for me, and I know so many other people who've been through the Wasaic project. And I think he's great. And he's someone that I share a lot with as far as painting is concerned. We, sort of have a constant conversation going on and sometimes send each other photos and ask questions about what's working and not working. And yeah, I love his work so much.
Mm-hmm.
So it felt extremely affirming to be asked.
Good. And the connection between these prints are just look incredible in the space, and certainly the conversation between them is clear. We love this pairing.
Yeah, it's so vibrant. It brings the whole room kind of together. And these are prints, but they kind of hold the whole space really tied together in a very interesting dynamic.
What was so interesting is that like when we got these files, we couldn't see so much of what was happening. And then they came out of the printer and we had our white gloves on and we were looking through, and this happened with Manuela and Daniela too, where we were like, what? Because we had gotten these before we had gotten the shipment of any of the artwork that was coming from out of state. So this was really the first time the artwork became physical in any way. Like this was the first time we had seen it in our hands, even in this on paper, but we hadn't collected any of the work or gotten the shipment. So it was just like we saw things through the print, like the layers of the textures, and it was just like.
Yeah, and then we were more aware of how much we lose when we're just watching the screen of our phones, that everything's reduced to the size of the screen, either in our computers and our phones.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
It was just a wild, because I think the same with Manuela. I've only ever seen your work on the screen. So to get the print printed out and then to receive your work in a surprisingly flat box, I was like, this can't be it. Like this total suspension of like what you think is happening versus what is actually happening. So Jack, I really hope I get to see your paintings in person too.
Yeah.
because Will's in person, the textures are bonkers. Like they're just a lot of this information is just really difficult to perceive what's happening.
To translate into something different.
Yeah. But that kind of it is an exciting thing too, because it's a total suspension of like, what is this? Like what's going on here? And then
how does it function as an object?
What's that?
How does it function as an object?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think that's something that me and Will share a lot, is the way we sort of suspend mark making in different ways. Will's using like he kind of uses a lot of monoprinting techniques. Like he'll pull paint off of objects on the canvas sometimes. So like he'll have like an old piece of metal grating and he'll put paint on it and then pull that off, and that's in the painting. And yeah, I think that's the conversation of space making, and then also sort of isolating Mark.
Right, exactly.
In a way, like idiosyncratic language.
Yes, and the gesture is incredibly sculptural, just like the distance between the body and the object that's making the impression on the flat surface. It sort of, again, goes back to Monica's work about that straddling of the 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional spaces. And
I also feel like this is very much connected to the language of like patterns and collage. And it makes me, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, it makes me think of Manuela's work.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think the
I
Decker
didn't know
does,
if yours
too.
was coming next, but
Yeah.
I was pretty sure because I could see it right there, you know. And this is an interesting conversation too, because you, like when you see it on a screen, I guess also when we visited your studio virtually, we assumed these were pattern fabrics on top of each other collected, and then you pretty much explain verbally that these were materials collected together, but that none of the patterns were there until you painted them over there.
yeah.
Yes, yeah. I'm loving actually hearing everybody talk about their process, because I'm appreciating your curatorial ideas and the way things came together even more, because there's so many things people have talked about that resonate with me so much. And that, like the main idea that really that I really connect to is like that filter of the screen, and how you almost end up with two different artworks, right? Like this little tiny photograph that you share or you use to document your work, that I guess kind of like gives you access to one layer of the work, which is kind of like the color and composition. But for people, like it seems like most of us here, where the process and the interaction between the materials and how they come together and the texture is so important, then seeing it in person adds a completely different layer, right? And it becomes almost this investigation of, you know, what came first and what those layers actually are and how they interact with each other, which sounds a lot like what you guys are thinking about with the way things are installed and the print versus the object. And so, yeah, I've loved hearing just how everybody talks about that, because that conversation I had with you guys in my studio about you being surprised that these are actually like paintings and not just like collages of fabric happens really often. And it's something that people don't usually find out until they're looking at the work in person, or you're getting to look at a close-up like this one right here. Yeah.
And then you get to feel the sculptural quality of what's happening, but not only on the surface, but also like we talked about this in your studio visit too, like the absolute the gesture and the bodily force that has to go into pushing these layers of paint into these various fabrics.
Yeah.
That space too is considered.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there's kind of like this conversation. I guess this is always happening for any painter, but there's always this conversation between like the pigment and the surface that you're applying it to. And I'm sort of like magnifying that with sort of like inserting these objects that, you know, like make the paint react in slightly different ways than I would when I'm painting just on canvas or something flat. Like in this one, you have this like bath mat that I'm connecting to a piece of canvas, and you can really see when you're coming up close how different that interaction between the paint and the surface is on both sides of the piece.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's sort of like this like layering and thinking about like objects that you have from home and creating within that, and figuring out ways to sort of like honor that and highlight that, but at the same time break that apart or deconstruct it in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and it's so interesting to think about like everyone's unique position here. Like Manuela, this is a physical work that you have installed in the space in addition to print, but then your experience of it has been entirely virtual and back onto the screen. You know, Laura and Jack and Sarah, your you're going digital to physical to digital, but not seeing the print. Deirdre, you have a flattening happening, but you actually were able to visit the gallery. So everyone has had a different relationship, even with the end result of the show.
Yeah.
So
Yes. Yeah.
Well, that's another example of how these was expansive instead of limiting.
Yeah.
And it allowed for more possibilities of experiencing an exhibition instead of like saying, well, no, I'm not going to be able to go to Chicago to see these, so I'm not going to be able to be part of this exhibition. Like even this conversation or reflecting on the process of each one of us that are part of it is different.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But I also think that was a very generous gesture on your behalf, because you spoke about your ideal viewer, and that's because you've left space for that viewer to put themselves in the exhibition and make these connections. You know what I mean? I think there's a real generosity in that.
Thank you.
Yes.
What can I say?
Yeah, thank you. We'll just giggle at
Yeah.
Manuela, do you want to talk about your print experience?
Yeah, I loved, this was one of my favorite parts of the project, actually, is this opportunity to invite somebody else to come into conversation with us. And I think, Emily, you were talking about how you invited somebody who you have so much in common in terms of like your upbringing, and Daniela Gomez and I we both grew up in Colombia, and we both immigrated to the United States at around the same age, and our work deals like with similar issues, and we're interested in similar processes, but that information is filtered and the work is so different, right? So the way we sort of like engage with those ideas and those materials is very, very different. But she's somebody who I've always talked to a lot about my work, and who I've had a relationship with her studio practice for a really long time. So I just like really love that, because it gives you an extra layer of information about the artist, like who they pick tell you so much about what they're thinking about and what kind of information they're absorbing and bringing into their practice. So I really loved this like idea of expanding the community, right? Inviting people in, giving them this opportunity to share the things they're thinking about and doing, but then, like having that be expanded and bringing somebody else in. So I love Daniela's work, and I love her. So it was really great to get to have this little conversation and moment of interaction.
I'm so glad.
Yeah.
I'm so glad. Yeah.
And the works kind of like also have a like the shape of both pieces are like they talk to each other in a very interesting way. Like they create a space of dialogue that formally is very, very interesting too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess more install shots.
More install
and
shots.
Some other
images that have the same sensibilities. But we can end with our this sort of, again, this physical space sharing, right? Like we invited each of the 16 artists with both physical work and work that would manifest it as a print to verbalize an object that they wanted us to collect on this end. So again, thinking about how we send information, how we can flatten space, and how we can talk about things that are collective community experiences. Like these were common enough objects that we either had them on hand or were very easy to collect or find. There's a printout in the gallery of whose object is whose, but you can maybe make that connection for yourself too. Like, where do you see the overlaps happening, and how these objects sort of share space on a shared table is meant to, again, refer to all the other sort of layering and sharing and conversations that are happening in the exhibition.
Yeah, and it also points to community, and like each art, like not everyone could make it physically to the gallery, but they're represented there through like an object that is pretty much linked to their practice.
Yeah. So we've gone over the time, but we can take questions
Yeah,
maybe.
maybe we can do
Oh.
stop share so that we can see the
Yeah.
chat. Maybe people are not, yeah, see their faces. It's good to see everyone here.
Hmm.
Um,
That's my brother.
Oh, I have a question. How did you two come together to come up with this idea, this concept of this exhibition?
We were in the fieldwork residency together at CAC, which is when we first met. And I saw the open call at Heaven, which they do every year for open call for exhibition proposals. And I had just had my second baby and wanted to sort of use this as a way back in, possibly, but really just getting the proposal together was the thing. Like, we did not imagine any of this wonderful stuff to have. It feels like magic, right? So the proposal was it, and it was a way to sort of make sure that Karen and I could be friends, because I really like Karen, and
It's so mutual. I'm so grateful for it because it really just made an excuse for us to work together, feel productive, talk to each other multiple times a week,
yeah,
and also really take this risk of trust. You know, we trusted each other. We came in a very generous, like we really were just, you know, generous with each other in a sense that we could make jokes and try one thing and then the other, and it was fine. And we really just wanted to connect with a larger community. So really, this pandemic has shown most of us that collaboration is the way. Working together as a group instead of just getting to to be by ourselves, like the stars of the moment, right? That makes much more sense because you go back and forth, you have an active dialogue, you grow, you commit to something larger than yourself. So I think it really, like, the whole process points to, like, to me, it points to bringing collaboration to a whole new level.
mhm.
I mean, and we became like really good friends.
Yeah.
So this is the best gift.
Yeah, I can't imagine anybody else getting to the end of a project that has been this intense and time consuming and being like, let's do it again, and like
That's fantastic. The
So,
the whole collaboration and
Yeah.
you know and being in the pandemic and everything. It's like everybody's in their own little their homes, and then you guys got a community together
but it
and
also
that's
it points back to the strength of
great.
our work that we put forward, because like I think we wanted to put a show together with our work, and then we thought, well, let's invite more people. So I think I said, well, what about we sort of talked loosely about time and revisiting and re-examining through these layers and lenses, and I said, well, I know 3 people who are doing this, and Karen said, well, these 3 people who are doing this, and I cannot believe, I mean, how well it all goes together just from that launch pad. Like, how is that possible that, we just could put,
Yeah.
you
I
know?
also feel like it was a good opportunity to bring people from different parts of our life experience into this conversation. I see a friend who I haven't talked to in years in here, Jared. It's so good to see you. I just want to acknowledge that I'm noticing another magic thing coming into this conversation. It never ends. It's just amazing.
Mhm.
But like, I invited a friend from Mexico, friends from New York, from different parts of my growing up and studying, and I lived here and there, and I moved many times. And just like arriving at this place with this community, it just makes so much more sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's great. We're very happy with it.
Yes.
I hope it extends that to you as well.
Well, I have to thank you for pulling this all together and being wonderful about everything and all the generosity of your time. I know you both have children, and this isn't easy to pull off. So thanks again.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah, and we also want to thank Heaven for all the support.
Yes.
You know, it's been great working with you. It's like the energy of that space is amazing.
Yeah. Alma, you said that this was a very heaven show. What do you like? Do you want to say anything?
I think that I meant that it's so multidisciplinary. There's so much going on, and it feels like it's saying something significant. So in that regard, there's just so many different takes and different perspectives that I feel like work really well together. I'm actually interested in the table. Can you tell me like maybe one piece off the table that is an interesting pairing to one of the pieces in the exhibition?
Yeah. Anybody can chime in about their object that they chose. Sometimes like Monica mentioned at the beginning about sort of like her choice of the sewing scissors being directly tied to a critical gesture that she uses in her work, right? And then Daniela and the green thread, we saw in that print, like we can see definitely the formal connection to how that is in the work. But
Why don't you talk about your object, maybe?
Yeah, I used striped fabric just because it's something that I use. My kids are always wearing stripes, and I just find it a lot in our family photos, and just stripes keep on coming up. And I use a lot of abstractions from those photographs in my drawings arranged with objects on the top. And so the striped fabric just is a thread that goes through a lot of the work. So, and then do you want to talk about?
I was thinking of formally of the blue that it's in some of the pieces of the show. I'm thinking of an object that uses a handle. So that like that negative space, it's kind of like a beautiful shape that goes back and forth between the pieces, and it translates into the handles by themselves that don't care, like that are the structures on the first piece that I showed, and like your hand, like the use of the hand again to carry something else, the space that container will make grow something different. So that's why I use that blue can, the jar.
Yeah, and so sometimes the objects were really open-ended, like Jack said, a postcard from nature, and that was it. And then sometimes it was Deirdre's was on the opposite end of the spectrum, where it came with very detailed instructions of what object, but also how it was meant to be activated and displayed, which was the cardboard box and the.
We can go back to that image just for a minute. I mean, we're almost.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
If anyone else wants to pipe up.
And this was also like unexpected. We didn't know how formally these objects would gonna be, like how large they were or how small, and we had to decide on the size of a pedestal or a table to display everything.
Yeah.
It works so well together, and I feel like it makes the conversation so much more deeper. I love the way your son, Emily, was like, those are my blocks. You didn't ask to use them.
Oh, I got in some big trouble for that one. Are those my blocks? Just burst into tears. I should have just lied. Oh boy.
Well, I want to thank everyone for today.
Yes.
We're starting to get a lot of people walking in and come into this room. And so we just want to give them an opportunity to see the full exhibition. And if you're in Chicago, we are open today from 1 to 6, tomorrow 1 to 5. It's a beautiful exhibition, and invite your friends. And thank you, Emily and Karen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining.
Yes.
It's been great.
It's been great. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.